I know it may seem crazy, but the truth is that I never felt so alive. Until recently, I was that woman that no one noticed. Married for years, boring routine, desire erased, and suddenly a simple push changed everything. And guess who showed? Me, this other side of life, my own nephew. Yes, you heard right. He was always that uninhibited guy, full of attitude, and one day he released a phrase that moved me. "Aunt, you have a big body. Why don't you show a little more?" I laughed, pretended to find it absurd, but that idea was in my head. It was just a joke, right? But the next day, I got in the mirror trying a tighter clothes. Red lipstick, one click here, another there, and that's it. My first different post. And there it was like opening the door to a world I had never explored. A world where I was not just the predictable wife, but desired, noted, admired. Each like was like an adrenaline dose. Each bolder comment, a shiver on the skin. Only I didn't imagine it would become such a big snowball, even if a simple like could make me so wet with curiosity. And the worst, I never thought my husband would notice, or rather, he would start to suspect. But now it was too late. I was addicted to attention, the likes, the comments. And when I saw I was already stuck in a game that I didn't even know how to get out anymore. And the worst of all, the boldest comments were coming from someone who should not. That's when everything changed. So what did I do? Well, sit down, but the story is just beginning. I was always the predictable woman in the family. It's the one that everyone looked at and said she's too, right? She would never do anything wrong. Stable wedding, discreet clothes, impeccable posture. If they saw me on the street, they would say I'm an exemplary wife. But no one knew what happened here. No one knew how bored. I was stuck in a bland, emotion-free routine. My husband no longer looked at me as before, and I started to feel invisible. It turns out that behind this behaved woman image, there was something inside me asking to be awakened. And it was my own nephew that made me see it. He was always that uninhibited guy, said everything in the can without shame of anything. And every time he played with me, saying that I should let go more, I just laughed. But the truth is that this was hammering in my head. That's when, at a family lunch, he released a comment that caught me off guard. He looked at me from above and let out, "Aunt, you have a big body." If I were a woman, I would post a photo now and get a lot of compliments. I laughed, tried to disguise, but I felt something different at that time. For the first time in a long time, someone was seeing me in a different way. I could pretend it meant nothing, but my body reacted before my mind. That night, as I changed to sleep, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. For the first time, I really looked at myself, played my skin, watched my curves, and asked myself, and if it's right, maybe I was really hiding. Maybe inside me there was a woman who wanted more. It's more attention, more desire, more emotion. The problem, after this idea came into my head, it was impossible to get it out. That's how it all started. That night was different. After my nephew's comment, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I looked at myself in the mirror as I hadn't done a long time ago. Was he right? Was I hiding a side of mine that I didn't even know myself? I took my cell phone and opened the camera. I made a pose, threw my hair to the side, rode my finger on my lips, and clicked. The photo was unlike anything I had already posted. I hesitated, but something inside me pulsed. So, without thinking too much, I posted the heart shot. I had never done that. My photos have always been discreet, but now that image showed a woman I barely recognized. And the answer came fast. The likes began to rise. The comments, too. I didn't even remember that followed me appeared out of nowhere. Some praised, others did innuendo, and it moved me in a way I didn't expect. But what really surprised me was a specific like, his. Yes, my nephew. I stared at the screen and a shiver traveled my body. He didn't comment on anything, but that simple gesture seemed to say more than any word. He saw. He approved. That's when I felt the taste of danger. It was just an innocent photo, but I knew I was going the way that was no longer back. But the game was more interesting when he decided to send me a message. I liked the photo, Aunt. Finally freeing yourself, huh? My heart accelerated. I could simply ignore, pretend nothing happened, but my fingers moved alone. Do you really think? What did I expect with this answer? I didn't know, but I felt a warmth climb the body, while waiting for the next message. After all, if a simple click already made me like this, imagine what would come later. That became a dangerous game. I knew I should stop, but I couldn't. It was just a conversation, just an innocent flirt. No big deal. At least that's what I tried to convince myself. My nephew began to comment on all my photos, always with that provocative tone that only he knew how to use. This picture is beautiful, but I could show a little more, huh? This ant is stealing the scene. If my uncle knew what's losing, I pretended to find it funny, but inside I felt something different. With each like, with every bold comment, my body responded in a way that I couldn't control. And it wasn't just him. Other men began to appear, some acquaintances, others complete strangers, and I felt powerful. Finally, they were seeing me, wishing me, giving me the attention I missed so much. The problem is that my husband also started to notice. "You're different," Kay said one night, watching me with an eye. "It's more vain, more excited." Did something change? My heart froze. I swallowed dry and forced a smile. "Your impression, love, just taking care of me more." He did not seem totally convinced. I did not insist, but I knew I needed to be more careful. I started to erase messages, waiting for him to sleep to move his cell phone. I was becoming an expert in maintaining secrets, and the more I hid, the more my nephew I teased. One night, he sent me a message. "Aunt, I bet you never had the courage to send a picture just for me. Do you have?" My body reacted before my mind. The adrenaline rose, the excitement took over. My fingers slid down my cell phone, and before I could think twice, the photo was sent. What I didn't know is that from then on, it would no longer be back. And that's when the situation started to get out of my hands. That was starting to get out of my control. At first, I felt in charge. I thought I could play with the fire without burning me. But now, everything seemed different. My husband was increasingly attentive. He began to watch me more, noticing details that once went unnoticed. "You walk different," he said one day, with a suspicious look. "It seems happier out of nowhere. Is something happening?" My heart fired. I took a deep breath and let out a forced laugh. "Love, I'm just taking care of myself, feeling good about myself. Is this bad?" He smiled, but his eyes said something else. "The worst is that I was handing myself. I spent more time on my cell phone, posting more daring photos. And with each photo, my nephew made a point of being there, leaving those comments that made me shiver. But it wasn't just him. Other men started sending messages. Some were straightforward, others tested the boundaries. "If your husband doesn't value you, let me know. You don't deserve to get stuck in this wedding. What you need is someone who knows how to take care of you." I ignored it, but at the same time, it made me excited. Tension, temptation, adrenaline of being desired. Until one day, my husband did something that caught me by surprise. As I bathed, he took my cell phone. When I left the bathroom, he was sitting on the bed, holding the device. He raised his eyes slowly and asked, "Want to explain to me, why are you erasing messages?" My body froze. "What messages?" I tried to disguise, drying my hair to gain time. "Those who are no longer here," he replied, turning his cell phone between his fingers. "I can recover everything if you want, you know?" Swallowed dry. He didn't blink. He studied me as if he already knew the answer. There, I knew I couldn't escape anymore. At any moment, everything could collapse. And the worst, I didn't know if I wanted him to find out or if deep down I wanted a reason to go even further. I knew I needed to be careful, but that adrenaline made me lose the sense of risks. After the conversation with my husband, I became more discreet. I deleted notifications, disabled messaging previews, and changed to the phone password. But none of that was good. My heart accelerated every time my nephew sent me a message. Was getting bolder? "We could meet such a day, right?" I read that several times, as if my body already knew the answer before my mind. That would be very wrong. I typed, but I didn't send it. I stayed there staring at that phrase, feeling a warmth up around the body. That's when he sent another message. "Wrong is keeping wanting and pretending that nothing is happening." My whole body answered. My fingers slid down the screen, and before I realized I was already typing. "Do you have any idea what you're talking about?" "I think you have," he answered, and this time there was no joke in the tone anymore. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I could erase that message and pretend nothing happened. I could block, change the course of things. What did I want? The truth is that I was addicted to that feeling. In tension, in danger, the desire to be discovered and at the same time escaped by a threat. Then he sent the message that took me the floor. If you don't want to, I understand, but I think you don't want to stop. So tell me, when will we stop being just words? My heart fired. My fingers trembled on the screen. I could end it there, but the fire had already spread inside me. And that's when I made my choice. The problem is that secrets are never hidden for a long time, and mine was about to come out in a way I could never imagine. That was no longer just an online game. The messages, the flirtations, the provocations were about to become real. My nephew didn't press, just waited for my answer. But I knew what I wanted. I wanted to feel that adrenaline. I wanted to see how far I could go without being discovered. We set a discreet meeting in a place that no one would recognize us. I chose a glued dress. Nothing exaggerated, but fair enough to feel desired. The heart beat so hard that it seemed that everyone on the street could hear. I got in the car and drove with trembling hands. Every kilometer, my breathing was heavier. I could still give up, could still turn around and pretend it never happened, but every fiber of my body begged to move on. When I arrived at the agreed place, he was already there, leaning against the car, waiting for me. With that smile from those who knew he had won the game, I stopped before him and felt the weather slow down. I didn't need words. His gaze devoured my body, and I felt my skin burn. He approached. The heat between us was almost unbearable. My body reacted before my mind. My heart fired. It was at this moment that my cell phone vibrated. I looked at the screen and my blood froze. It was my husband. His hand was still at my waist when the phone rang again. I had two choices: answering and pretending that nothing was happening, or ignoring and getting lost at that moment. I thought of lying, in inventing any excuse. But at that moment, I realized that I had already crossed a limit from which I might not want to go back. And that's where everything came out of control. I answered the phone, trying to keep my voice firm, but my heart seemed to want to jump out of my chest. Where? My husband asked on the other side of the line, swallowed dry. My nephew was still. They're too close, with that look of whom I knew I wouldn't have the courage to tell the truth. I went out to solve some things, I said, trying to sound natural. What things? His voice was not accusatory, but there was a tension there. My brain worked fast, seeking any plausible excuse. But before I could answer, I heard the noise of notification on my cell phone. My blood froze. My husband was silent for a moment and then asked, "Did you just receive a message?" I froze. The screen still shone, and to my despair, the name that appeared was my nephew. I felt my stomach turn. It was sending a message at that very moment, without even imagining the danger it posed. "Who sent you a message?" My husband insisted. My brain screamed for me to think fast, but my hands shake. If I looked at the screen, he would notice. If I looked, he might ask what it was. So, to make matters worse, my nephew sent another message. "I can't believe you answered. It's making me want to, huh?" The air disappeared from my lungs. My husband heard the notification and stepped back. "Who's sending you a message like this?" he asked, now with a much more serious tone. I held my cell phone tightly, trying to keep calm. "No one important," I muttered. But my husband didn't seem convinced. He reached out. "Then let me see." My heart fired. I knew that if I delivered the phone, everything would be over. And at that moment, I realized that there was no way out. He was going to find out everything, and I couldn't stop it anymore. My heart was hitting so hard that it looked like it was going to get out of my chest. My husband was still outstretched, hoping me to hand over my cell phone. "Is there anything you want to tell me?" he asked. And this time his voice was different. It wasn't just curiosity, it was suspicious. I could feel the weight of the moment. I had two choices: handing over my cell phone and letting everything come out, or try to escape once again. I grabbed the device hard and forced a smile. "Love, you suspicious of me?" He crossed his arms, said nothing, just waited. That's when the cell phone vibrated again. This time, the name on the screen was impossible to ignore. "Tell me, when do we see each other again?" The message said, "My husband saw." His expression changed on time. He took the cell phone from my hand before I could react. My body froze. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice low but loaded with tension. I tried to get the phone back, but he held firmly. His eyes went through the screen, and at that moment I knew it was all over. The silence was deafening. I couldn't think. I couldn't speak. "Are you cheating on me?" he asked, swallowed dry. It was now. I needed to decide. Confess everything and beg forgiveness, or keep lying to the end. My mouth opened to speak, but he raised his hand. "I don't want to hear excuses," he said, his face closed. "I want to know the truth." The air looked heavy, suffocating. My eyes ran to the door as if there was any way out for that. "It was just a joke," I whispered, trying to cling to the last excuse I was left. He laughed, but it wasn't a fun laugh, a joke. He turned his cell phone to me. "Does this look like you, joke?" I had no answer anymore. I needed to decide there at that moment. And that's where my life turned upside down. At that moment, I knew that nothing more would be as before. The silence between us was heavy. My husband was holding his cell phone, looking at the screen as if he tried to understand when everything had begun to go wrong. I could lie, make up some absurd excuse, pretend it was misunderstanding. But looking into his eyes, I realized it was no use. "Tell me the truth," he repeated. And for the first time in a long time, I did just that. I told you everything. I didn't omit details. I didn't try to justify myself. I just let the words come out one by one, feeling the weight of each one. My husband heard everything in silence. When I finished, he let out a long breath and shook his head. "Did you want attention?" he asked. "Was that just that?" I had no answer, because deep down, maybe that was just that. I felt invisible, forgotten, erased within a marriage without emotion. But I chose the worst possible way to try to change it, and the price I paid was high. My husband left that night without saying anything. The next day, she got her things and left. The wedding that I spent years building collapsed in a matter of seconds, and my nephew, he went on with life as if nothing had happened. In the end, I realized that the problem was never him, my husband, or anyone else. The problem was always me. I sought emotion in the wrong place. I confused desire with freedom, adrenaline with happiness. In the end, I ended up alone. If I could go back in time, I would have done everything differently. But now, all I have left is the consequences of my choices, and a question that still echoes in my mind: was it worth it? Perhaps this is the answer I will never have.